Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me today. We're going to be looking at lesson 6, and which is a deep dive into soil, or a partial deep dive anyways. And yeah, we'll go through the assignment here, and I'll probably fill in a few gaps for you as well, because there's some future changes coming to this part of the course. And good for everybody to know how it's going to evolve over time and what you might want to keep your eyes on. So let us just share the screen here. There we go. Yeah, so I'm sure most of you have looked at it. Lesson 6 is a whole lot easier than lesson 5. Let's go through it anyways. And I think everybody in my group here is from the US, and in the US there's this wonderful resource, and it's the USDA's Web Soil Survey. So that is sort of step one in the assignment, is activating that, and you hit this button here, and then I've just kind of randomly shot myself into an area. I'll just quickly show you how you go through this, although I'm sure there is a tutorial video on it. But basically, when you find your area of interest, your project site, you want to define the area of interest. And you can do that in a couple of different ways, but probably the easiest way is just using a rectangle here. So what that does is it's going to define the area that we want to map, rather than mapping the whole of the US. So we just hit that soil map button, and that's going to shift us into that. And you can see we're in Seattle, actually, so it's not a very exciting soil survey there, being urban, but we do have some information on the left here. And again, we want you to sort of copy this info into your assignment. And this gives us, a snapshot of what should be there. So we're looking at sort of a gravelly, sandy loam. And then we're going to go through and have you do some jar tests to either confirm that or just see what's going on with your project site itself. So again, this is quite an easy first step. And I do believe, there we go, there is a tutorial on it if you find it at all confusing. And then some information that we want included on the template here. So this is where you just take a screenshot, and here's where you'd want to put your descriptions. So that's pretty straightforward. And again, that's a fantastic resource for the US. Where I live in British Columbia, Canada, we have something fairly similar, but it doesn't cover the whole province. It's really just in pockets, but it again is very, very helpful. And we typically will look at this very, very early on in the design phase, just to get an idea of what we're dealing with. So Elsa, you have a question?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different soils around my property, but my property only has 2. So how far do I go, and like what do you want us to describe, just what's on the property or truly all around it?
Well, we're really mapping your project site as
Okay.
accurately as one can. Now, if we're on a large acreage, it's going to be, especially if there's a lot of topographic changes on the property, you're going to have very different soils. And in that case, you might want to, if you're doing 2 or 3 samples, you might want to consider that when you're taking your samples. Maybe you want something in a lower, more fertile area, or maybe you have sort of a dry, rocky area. So try and, consider that when you're doing your jar tests. The other thing is to consider with your jar tests, perhaps you have some pasture that's not performing as well as you want, or perhaps it is, and you want to take a look, deeper look at the soils and what might be contributing to that. So there's a few options there for you, but yeah, we just really want to focus on the project site itself. And quite often, agricultural sites will have, multiple soil types going through them, especially on the web soil survey here. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, and the example showed like whole much bigger area, so I was just wondering, but I'll leave it to the side for now.
Yeah. So yeah, every area is going to be incredibly different. But if you do, I would encourage everybody to really explore this site. We're not going to do that today, but there are a lot of resources here. And I wouldn't be necessarily doing that if you're in an urban location like this, because there's so much disruption. The odds of original soils being in place are pretty low. But when we get into other outlying areas, yeah, it's really quite a remarkable resource. So okay, so that is step one. We want to know basically what the survey says about your project site. And then we're going to look at the test itself. And there's a number of different tutorials here. It's a very simple jar test, very easy to conduct. And it's I would say it's a good starting point. It'll give you an idea about your sand, silt, clay, your texture, which is part of the whole, we'll call it. The one thing we're not really diving into here is soil food web, and that is something that is going to be coming to this part of the course in later renditions. So if you want to do a little bit of exploration on that, you can certainly Google that. Dr. Elaine Ingham is a sort of leading soil scientist who was part of developing the soil food web up until, I can't remember what year it was. I'm sure it would say in here. Up until that point, there wasn't a tremendous amount of knowledge about life in the soil other than organisms that we could visually see. But after diving into the research here, it was apparent that there's an awful lot going on that we're not aware of. And there's some very good videos here on Dr. Elaine Ingham's site. You can go take a look. These are some free videos, some case studies, pretty amazing work that she has done. I have taken a number of her courses. I was going to become a soil food web consultant in one part of my career, but decided it was not the avenue I wanted to take. But a very, very interesting topic nonetheless. So yeah, this is such a huge part of growing plants, and you definitely don't want to ignore that, even though our this section of the course really doesn't dive into it. It is going to in coming years. So it's a big part that you don't want to leave out. And the texture part is just that. It's really a non-living snapshot. So what components of sand and silt and clay are within your soils, and it's important information. But the reality is we can get all of these soils behaving like loam if we have the right ingredients in terms of organic matter and soil organisms. So we will leave it at that. Again, there's a couple of videos here on how to do the jar test. It's very, very simple. So if you're not totally sure, I would encourage you to take a look at these resources. And if you feel like you've got a fair bit of clay in your soil, you'd want to try and do that as soon as possible, because it could take, 4, 5, 6 days for the clay to start settling out in your jar. So as you can see here, there is some clay suspended in the water here. And yeah, so that is something to consider. Just one sec here. All right, sorry about that. Yeah, so there's written instructions here on the soil texture. There's a link to a pyramid calculator. The pyramid's pretty basic. You're just going to be aligning your percentages of sand, silt, and clay. Yeah, so that is the testing portion. And right here is basically we want to have your base plan, and then you indicate which 3 places within that you've taken your test, right? And then, there should be a little, as you can see here, there's a little bit of info, what kind of microclimate, what kind of vegetation, and the reason, right? So often it could be, well, I want to grow a new vegetable garden, or the area is underperforming, and this test is a good first step in trying to determine how to improve an area, or why an area may be underperforming. So a lot of times what we'll find as well is that even though your soil texture may be one that indicates a free draining area, it's quite possible you have compaction that is showing a different reading. In other words, you don't have very good drainage with your infiltration tests. So maybe that has nothing to do with the texture. It may have something to do with the activities on the site before your test. So compaction can persist for a long time. And that's something that you don't want to ignore, whether it's on a small site or a very large site. A couple of ways we can deal with that, and we will get into that for sure. But this is that first page where you just want to indicate where your tests are. And then we have 3 pages here for each individual jar test. So those are pretty straightforward. The hardest part of this, I think, is getting a really good image of your jar. And you have to have just the right lighting in order for somebody to be able to look at this and see the distinct layers that are within it. Okay. And then often you'll get, let's get my pen here. Often you'll have a floating line of organic matter at the top, and that's not considered at all in this test. We're not looking at anything that is living. We're looking at strictly sand, silt, and clay particles and how that makes up your soils. Okay. So yeah, so we have 3 of those slides, and of course, little image, and do make sure you do the percolation test. That is, in my opinion, really important. And the other option here is, if you weren't doing that, is using a penetrometer. I'll show you the one I've got here. That's a PDF. Okay. Yeah, this is a very simple apparatus that you basically push into the soil. You have 2 different types of tips, and it provides resistance on this gauge here. And when I was taking some courses through Dr. Ingham, her magic number would be right here, 150. So if you have soils that are showing resistance of 150 psi or greater, you're going to find that most plant roots can't penetrate that. They're not going to like it. So this is a really good indicator of not only what you're dealing with in terms of compaction, but also the depth. So we run this through our annual vegetable garden every year, and we used to have a little bit of compaction issues, and now we don't. If we do have any issues with compaction in a smaller area, we will tend to use a broad fork. And we've got one that's very similar to the meadow creature. Yeah, there we are. Kind of looks like this. So that's great for annual veg, market gardens, you know. It's really good for the Pacific Northwest, very aggressive. And then I'll show you the next idea here. Go ahead, Natalie.
Like testing the compaction level, does the soil moisture level, do you have to take that into consideration? Like, I know that it's a lot harder, like my soil is a lot harder, like mid-August when it's very dry versus, you know, taking it in November or February when it's very wet here.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And yeah, you'll find that if you have a fair amount of clay in your soils in the summer, it almost can take on a concrete like, you know, very, very hard. So yes, that is a consideration. If you're using the penetrometer, that would be a consideration during dry weather. If you're just doing you're digging a test hole and you're doing an infiltration test, typically what you do is if it's really dry, you would sort of fill the hole and sort of let it go through one infiltration cycle and then try it again. So you do have a little bit of moisture in there. So yeah, that's a good question, and you definitely want to factor that in. One thing about, where are we here? About the penetrometer is as you're pushing this into the ground, it will tell you where you have the compaction issues. So if you, let's say you're Elsa and you have a little farm and you have a penetrometer and you're pushing it into a pasture, you might find, oh wow, it's from 4 to 6 inches of depth, I've got all this compaction, and then it breaks free. That could be due to a tractor running over it. It could be maybe the paddock got quite bare when there was livestock on it, and that has caused some compaction. So there's this is a very handy tool for kind of taking it one step further, for finding out where in that soil profile you're having trouble. And if you were in, let me just get back to, sorry, I'm just having trouble. There we are. So for agricultural setting, the way of dealing, oops. One of the ways you can deal with compaction is if you can find a keyline plow. And we've used these on sites before, and they do an amazing job. You can see that it's almost like a subsoiler of sorts. It's going to be breaking up that subsurface, but not turning. You're not turning the soil over. You're not a minimal disturbance on the surface. There's also, if you look at this one, there's a roller on the back of this. So when it makes its cut, it's pushing down and trying to sort of push that gap together again so you can get animals on it quicker. But what we do is where I live, there's one of these plows on Vancouver Island, so we can rent it. And then just have a 50 horsepower or greater tractor pull it. And it's very quick. So you could probably, I'm trying to remember how quick it was. Yeah, I'm not sure how many acres per hour it does, but it does depend a little bit. If you have very rocky ground, you're going to be pulling up rocks. So that's one disadvantage. We had one site that was clear cut and very nasty. Our client had clear cut it and had bulldozed it, and we went in with a penetrometer, and we couldn't get more than a 1/4 inch in the ground with our penetrometer. So we sent in a keyline plow to help, which it did, but it then started dragging up woody debris that got buried during the clearing process. So there can be some follow-up if you're on bare ground. But on a pasture like this, you're going to probably find that it's pretty straightforward. Just be rocks that could be a challenge. Now, the one nice thing about this plow, you probably can't see it here, but there's a sort of a safety pin on each one of these tips, so that if it does hit a rock, there's a shear pin and it will let go. And you just put another pin in rather than damaging the plow itself. So it's a brilliant plow. Can't say enough about it. You can also see in front of each one of these plows on this model, you have a turf cutter. So it makes a nice cut prior to that plow going in. So really exciting piece of equipment. And some of them even have compost tea applicators on the back. That's probably what we're doing here, seeding and compost tea. Yeah, lots of different setups that people have. So yeah, got distracted there. So yeah, that's all about our jar test. And we've gone through that. And then we're just going to kind of analyze all of this. So what are your local resources? So what nitrogen-rich resources do you have, and carbon-rich, anything else that is around? Now, this is a very interesting part of the document here. What are the limiting factors? So after you've gone through your jar test, what do you see that is potentially a challenge for the soils just based on your testing? And Elsa has a question here. What's the best time of year to use the keyline? Our experience is when there's moisture in the ground, Elsa. So you could run that in the fall, and you could also run that in the spring. But depending on your land, you know, your springtime might be, you might have wet areas. So you'd want to make sure there is some soil moisture, but that it's not going to be too difficult for a tractor pulling that. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if there are a lot of plows within your area that you could potentially rent. Again, that's the way to do it. You can buy one. I think they're about 10,000 US to get one from Australia, but renting's better for sure. So yeah, here's a couple of good notes to make. So how do your soil samples compare versus the mapping? So if you're in Portland, you know, this would be of interest, but reality is if you're out on a larger piece of property, this is going to be much more interesting to see how it does compare with the USDA map. And then some of the goals. So, and with those, you know, ideally, what you want to do is have a pretty broad approach to your soil management. You don't want to say, well, I'm going to apply biochar, and that's going to fix all my problems. You want to try and have this very broad approach where, you know, maybe you have biochar, but maybe you're doing a key line approach and adding adding compost tea, you're adding other organics, perhaps you're doing some cover cropping or rotational grazing, you're allowing for an area to recover properly. There's all kinds of approaches here, but you know, do try and look at it with a big picture rather than trying to solve any challenges here with, you know, one approach, because if it doesn't work, you know, you're back to zero. So you definitely want you'll find that some things do much better than others, and you'll also find that they probably support one another quite well. And an example of that would be adding organic matter. Let's say you have a market garden, adding organic matter in the spring, and then following that up with some compost tea application. You know, the organic matter is definitely going to support the compost tea. All those organisms need a place to live, and that's precisely what organic matter is going to provide. Okay, so yeah, this is it's a good part of the exercise, and then SWOT analysis. So that's pretty straightforward. You might find that you know, your soil's structure is a little different than you anticipated. You might find that you've got compaction, which you weren't maybe aware of, and that's certainly very, very common. Whenever we disturb the landscape, often compaction will follow that. Yeah, so that is about it for lesson number 6. Is anybody got any questions or anything we want to chat about regarding that? I will say, while you're considering that, I will say that even I was very lucky in my beginning years, which would have been a long time ago, way back in sort of mid 1980s. I was really lucky to work with some people that were completely into building soils in a natural way, and this is more in an ornamental setting, but it really did stick with me. And since then I've learned that you really want to cultivate your soil rather than your plants, right? So and I don't mean cultivate as in disturb. I mean is you really want to focus on building soil to support the plants that you've got. So one of the things that you might take away from all of this is that, and this is a service that we use, we will take a soil sample and we will send it off to a lab, a soil food web lab. And what happens there, and so you can see there's a lot of different labs listed here that you can check out. What that does, it's very, very interesting. So you send off a sample, they will take a look at it, they will tell you what is alive in your soil, so what living organisms are there, and you're also going to explain to them in your sample what you're trying to grow. So if it's off of a pasture, if it's in a market garden, if it's in a permanent planting, whatever it may be, they're going to provide you with some recommendations on how to shift that soil so that it's in more alignment with what you're trying to grow. And that sort of plays into soil succession. So if we look at soil succession, this is a good one. This says it all right here. So if we look at old growth forests, we go into the old growth forest somewhere and we say, hey, we want to grow some lettuce. We're probably going to have a whole lot of problems doing that, not just because of the deep shade that is cast under a typical old growth forest, but the soil organisms present. So they are very heavily fungal dominant, right? Whereas a newly disturbed piece of ground is going to be very bacterial dominant. So when we're testing soils, this is part of that information you're going to get. What is the ratio of fungal to bacterial organisms? And typically with market gardens, we're going to be kind of in the middle here. We kind of want to be even. And that does play into no-till, right? So if you do not disturb your soils, you are going to build on this fungal. You're more likely to build on the fungal components of the soil itself. If you're disturbing it, if you're tilling yearly, fungal organisms are very sensitive to disturbance, and you will find that no matter what you do, those numbers will probably be falling. So you might be kind of shooting yourself in the foot if you're trying to do one thing, if you're trying to grow a certain crop, but your soil practices are such that you're making it harder for those beneficial organisms to provide for your crop. Now, why is that? Well, it's in a nutshell. When you place compost on your garden, just an example, you would think, wow, there's all this food for my plants. And the reality is there may be some plant available nutrient in that, but for the most part, we need soil organisms to take that organic matter and convert it into plant available nutrient, right? So they have to ingest it, excrete it, or they are consumed by another organism and they're excreted. And it's at that point that we get the elements that are plant available. Plants can readily use. They can't use compost as it is, as such, right? So it's a two.
Compost tea. So
Yeah.
compost tea might be a better start.
Yeah, well, it's what we have found personally is there's a need for both. So if you have, let's say you have the situation, this is a better image here. Say you're right in this zone here where you have recent disturbance and you're applying compost tea or compost extract. Once that hits the ground, if there's not the habitat for those organisms, they're going to either go into dormancy or diminish in their population. So you do have to make sure that you have habitat for those organisms. So it is a two-step process in a lot of ways. We do with our veg garden in our property, we've done a lot of compost extract, and that's a lot easier. So what it is we make our own compost. That's quite diverse. So we know we have a lot of diverse organisms in it. We have an extractor. Let me see if I can. It's quite pretty inexpensive. We didn't buy anything fancy. We just built this ourselves. So something like this, you can get these cone tanks, right? And I think this is a 50 gallon. No, this is 30. So we have a 50, and we just partially fill it with water. And this is an air pump. So this is pushing air up through the bottom. And it actually creates a vortex within the tank. So by doing so, it's oxygenating all the water in there. So it's an oxygen-rich environment, and there's no blank spaces. So in some of these machines, even one like this, you're going to have these bottom corners are going to be low in oxygen. It's just the nature of the beast. Same with this. These edges are going to be really tricky. But with the cone, it's so much simpler. This is more what we have. And what we do is we have a mesh bag, and we fill that with compost, and we drop the bag into the tank, and we let it bag like this. They're specifically made for compost tea production. Can't see another one here, but so we leave that for about 20-30 minutes.
There was a cutaway. I think go down a little bit in your screen.
Yeah.
There, on the left, it looks like there's a
There
bag.
we are. Something. There you go. So I wouldn't recommend this method, but this is the concept. You have this strong vortex, and you have this aerated water, and it's basically blasting all the organisms off of the organic material. So over the course of 20 or 30 minutes, they're all off and they're in the solution. So then we pull the bag out, and it's basically compost without any organisms within it. And we just put it back on the compost pile, and it'll be re-inoculated over time, rehabitated. And then, so what happens is the mix, the liquid that's in one of these units, we shut this off, and we just drain it off into either a sprayer or a watering can, and we apply it to the soil. So with an extract, so we're just extracting the organisms, putting it onto the soil. That's super easy, right? Now, if we would take it to the next step, where we'd make compost tea, we would be doing the same thing, put the bag in, extract the organisms, pull the bag out, and then we would start adding food to boost the population of those soil organisms. Okay, so
let me understand what you're saying. So you're extracting the organisms out of the compost, and then you're applying that to the soil that needs organisms.
Yeah. And
the soil that you're placing these organisms in, what are they eating if the soil is already depleted? Do you have to add material to the soil for then the organisms to be like making the soil healthy again?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good question. There's a couple of ways of approaching it based on your context. So one example would be, let's say person, and this is common in ornamental settings, somebody wants to improve their turf grass, which sounds like a really boring thing to do, but one way you can do that is you can basically auger some holes into your soil profile, backfill that with some compost, and then apply your compost extract. So you're creating a little bit of a cushy environment for the organisms coming out of the applicator, whatever you're using. You could do broad fork and do the same, right? So that's kind of, if you were in a market garden situation, you would definitely have some compost applied. So applying your extract to, say, bare soil that's had no improvement, it would be, there'll be a percentage of success involved with that, but it'll be a largely, I won't say a wasted effort, but you probably have disappointing results. So that's why you have to think about, oh, right, we want more organisms. They need organic matter. How are we going to get this in here? The keyline plow is an example. If we can find one of those. So here they are applying, often they'll apply cover crop, seed, and biology at the bottom of the tines, so that all that soil biology is going low into the profile, hopefully towards the bottom of some of the pasture root depth. That is one of the things, but you do have to support, you have to provide some additional support. That would be my opinion, rather than just applying it to bare soil. Does that make sense, Andrea?
Yeah.
Okay. Where was I now? Yeah. So this is a great way, and we don't do compost tea, although there are some advantages of doing that. So for instance, if you're growing a crop, let's say you've got you're growing crops of summer squash or zucchini or something like that, that's say powdery mildew, is subject or is susceptible to powdery mildew. You could create yourself some compost tea and then apply that to the foliage, right? So you're applying with a sprayer that has never had herbicide in it to your plant foliage, and it will basically develop and take hold on the foliage itself. So it's like almost like looking at it like an armor coating. So there's this living protection on the leaf surface. So when mildew, powdery mildew spores fall onto that foliage, whenever that may be during the growth cycle, there are some organisms in place to take them out, to consume
So can
them.
you put that on roses?
Sure. Oh yeah. Yeah. You could, I don't think there's anything you couldn't utilize it on. You'd have to kind of time it, right? So say with summer squash, you'd want to start applying regularly when they're quite young, right? So when they're still in the greenhouse in flats or growing trays or whatever you're doing, and doing that in a very sort of easy, that's a very easy application. Then when you're out in the field, it's a little bit more, a little bit trickier. You need to have a different applicator. There's these kinds of things that have, some are electrics, this one's not, but that gives you some mobility. And the nice thing with these is often you'll have the ability to keep your solution aerated during your application. Because that's the thing, if you have this set up and you've done your compost tea creation. Now, the tricky part about the tea is you add food and you have to have a microscope, and you really should be monitoring your populations, because if you add too much food, you're going to cause an explosion in organism population, and it actually may end up that part of your solution is without oxygen, right? It may go sideways on you if there's too much of a good thing. So you do have to monitor the populations of your organisms to make sure that you're not getting into an anaerobic state. But yeah, it's fascinating. I spent a lot of time really diving into this, and I would say this is a wonderful addition to any scaled homestead or agricultural operation is the use of this. And this is often what you see, liquid tote being modified. Again, these have disadvantages because they're not getting the same aeration in the corners here, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you have anaerobic areas, those, if you think about it, those are actually where we get our non-beneficial organisms. They thrive in low oxygen. That's why compacted areas in your fields or your garden create really poor conditions for your plants, because not only the plant roots can't get where they want to go deep, but you're encouraging low oxygen organisms that tend to be harmful to plants and cause some issues, whether it's turf grass or pasture or potatoes or whatever. Yeah, it's a bit tricky. So extract is something that we've been doing, although next year we definitely grow a few plants that, and the summer squash are a good example of a powdery mildew plant that really, no matter what we do, we seem to get some powdery mildew. We still got a good crop and enough food, but something that we're looking at improving on. And I think application of compost tea would help that. But yeah,
when do you apply your compost tea during the seasonal rotations?
Well, I guess it would depend what you're growing. So if you're growing pasture, I would imagine that early in the growth cycle would be really beneficial. Tying that into perhaps decompaction, or if you have a compaction issue, addressing that. In market garden crops, you could set up a little bit of a schedule for yourself. We typically would begin applying it when they're in the greenhouse as starts, and then follow it up in the field as needed. So if you're say a no-till market gardener, you're applying a layer of compost every year at least, and you may or may not need that, right? The one challenge we've found with no-till is when you're growing things like brassicas, like kale, cabbage, anything like that, that typically do better in some disturbed. So their ratio is lower. They want a little more disturbance than, say, some of the other vegetables. So over time with no-till, we've found that those crops are underperforming. So a little bit of disturbance in the soil could actually be good for them. Whereas compost tea wouldn't help in that situation, because as you're building that fungal component, it's sort of working against what that particular plant wants. So I couldn't tell you, to answer your question, Andrew. I don't know if I have a real specific schedule that I could throw at you, but I would typically be looking at early and mid in the growing season, and you should see some pretty remarkable results. We have, but it does depend on sort of the baseline where you're starting. So if you've got a really depleted situation, you'll probably be doing some other things as well, like maybe you're creating your own compost, and maybe you're adding biochar to that, and then inoculating the biochar, and then adding that into your mix.
Okay, so another question. So we're talking about soil health and microorganisms and all these things that feed the plant because of the excretions or whatever in the soil. So
Mhm.
that's the soil portion. And then we're just talking a little bit about mildew on leaves and things like that.
Yeah.
And so then that led me to the idea of, there's bugs. So
Mhm.
commercial application or commercial growing, you have herbicides and fungicides. So
Right.
we talked about ways to help with the fungicides. So what about pesticides, the pests that come? Can we
Mm.
use compost tea to help with pests as well?
Sure. Yeah, I think what my observation over the years been, if you have, well, there's a couple of strategies there. If you're a commercial setup, so you're going to typically lean into that monoculture layout, right?
Mhm.
Rather than diverse plantings, let's say. So diversity will help with pests for sure. And if you're sort of sticking yourself out there and going with a lot of one type of crop, you'll find that plants that are inherently weak are the ones that attract pests. So that, knowing that right out of the gate, if you can boost the available nutrition within your soils and do everything else possible, have a good growing environment for the plants, you're going to be way ahead of it. And if you end up getting some pest problems, applying compost tea is not necessarily going to help you at that point. I would say, boosting your soil before any issue happens is where you're going to see that being really effective. Once you do have a problem, well, let's say you have aphids on your brassicas or whatever, that you're going to have to deal with differently when it happens. But as a way of preventing problems, absolutely. The better your soils are, the stronger your plants are, and they just inherently are going to resist being preyed upon.
So I definitely noticed that this year in my garden. So garden is more of a permaculture setup. I live in the middle of commercial zone of farming. And I noticed I did my beds are hugelkultur style. And this is the 4th year. In the 4th year, this year, I didn't have any aphids until recently. So went through all summer without any aphids, but I had this black flea beetle. I've never seen it before ever. And it started in a smaller bed that was not being tended to. Anyways, I share the garden with my brother and he wasn't really into it. Anyways, it just then took over the rest of the garden. So the rest of the actual hugelkulturs didn't have any bugs until it started in this weaker area like you were talking about. And the flea beetle just took over and just basically ate all the brassicas down to nothing.
Yeah.
Within 2 weeks. It was like super fast.
Yeah.
I'd never seen this beetle before, but I was so happy about the aphid issue. I was like, oh yes, the hugelkultur is working. I'm not having aphids. The plants are healthy. And then the flea beetle got me. And I'd never seen this bug before.
Yeah. The one thing you'll probably find in market garden situations is if they have a susceptible crop to flea beetles, they're often running some insect netting, right, as a cover over those. And that's very effective. Oh man. Well, not spelling too well today, but I'm sure I'll get what I want here. Yeah, there's all kinds of these nettings available, not mosquito. And this one's more for, there are a lot of different nettings out there, some ultra fine ones. So this is very, very popular with market gardeners.
Mhm.
And for a number of different flea beetles is one of them. Moths, all kinds of, and it works, but you have to be proactive, right? You got to
Yeah.
have that on, and it's more cost and more
Mhm.
work. Every time you irrigate, you got to take it off. Well, you don't have to, but and it doesn't last forever, but this is very, very effective with flea beetles. You just have to make sure there's so many different types of materials. And I'm not talking about remay. It'd be more like that looks more like remay. It'd be more of a
What is that?
netting.
What is
Remay.
remake?
Oh, well, that's more of a protective cover for temperature. If you have, let's say you are growing a frost, you're what's a good example? I've seen them placed over potatoes if they're trying to push. So if you're getting frost, say at the beginning or the tail end of your season, but you want your crop to go a little further, few more days, or you want it earlier in the ground, remay will give you, 2 or 3 degrees of protection. So just the fabric itself, it will protect your plants from that amount of frost. There's all kinds of different remay. It's very, very light. We use it quite a bit for keeping rabbits off of certain crops that, on a homestead level, it can work. Insect netting's better, but yeah, so remay is more cold protection, whereas this is more for insect, and this allows water to go through much easier than remay. So with remay, you're having to take it on and off. Both are good, but both are different.
Different applications.
Yeah, for different purposes. But for insect, I wouldn't recommend that. You can buy these in a roll. So you just decide what kind of width you want. And they're not cheap, but better to be protecting your crop than go to all that effort and have no yield. As you know, with flea beetles, they're very, very quick in their, and the same thing happened in British Columbia a couple of years ago with that heat dome that we got hit by. We have crickets in BC and on Vancouver Island where I am, and a colleague, John Bernakovich, another instructor here, he was in a hotter area, got close to 50 degrees Celsius, which is very hot. And anyhow, the crickets, when they're under stress, they go from cricket, they physically change from a docile kind of cricket that's very, very solitary to locusts. And they did exactly what you were describing with the flea beetle. They just turn into herbivores, and they destroy everything, like pastures, hay, vegetables, you name it. They just, there's no way of stopping them. They have pesticides for them, but they were not entirely effective. So there was this huge crop loss because this insect that's normally not an issue just changed with that heat stress. So it's fascinating. It sounds like Natalie's got a question here. Sorry, Natalie, I don't mean to ignore you here. It's like probiotics for plant and soil. Yeah, I gather you're referring to compost tea or compost extract. So you're quite right. It's and a compost extract is a really simple approach. That's why we have done that, and it's done a remarkable job on our soils. We haven't had to do that for a couple of years now because we've got we do no-till on our veggies, and we have built up our fertility enough where we don't have problems. This year, the only problem we have is deer. And we'll be rectifying that next year. So yeah, we're getting to the end of our meeting today, and it's always exciting to talk about soils. Does anybody have any other questions they want to chat about? I totally recommend you check out Dr. Ingham's website here. There's a whole bunch of free resources. So it's quite amazing. Her courses are great, but I don't know if they're the right fit for everybody. But just diving down this well, just learning more about soil health in terms of the life within the soil will help you out a lot. And it's quite amazing. I don't we don't apply any synthetic fertilizer at all, or lime or anything that we feel is going to create a challenge for soil organisms. And one of the reasons they can is the salt content. Even organic fertilizer has a certain salt content in it, which is not helpful to soil organisms. So it's unfortunate. There's not a real easy quick fix that way, but you know, you just have to kind of dial back to the older methods of applying high quality compost and making sure your soils have good aeration. That's just as we're wrapping up here. That's one thing that I discovered with Elaine Ingham's course is that top 8 inches of soil in your soil profile, it has an air exchange of once per hour. So you're getting air going in and out of that top 8 inches every hour. So it's really, you know, it's breathing, and that's a positive way of looking at it when you're out in the field. Even if you're, say, driving over an area with the machinery, and you think about the importance of maintaining that aeration. So really, yeah, don't forget about the soil organisms when you're looking at soils. The other portion in the assignment here is great, but that's just one part of it, right? So, all right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining me today. It's great to have you all back, and look forward to seeing your assignments next Monday. If you have any trouble or any problems this week, just drop me a note and I'll try and point you in the right direction. But yeah, good to be back online here and on the second half of the course. So yeah, so everybody have a great week, and thank you again for your excellent questions. It's very enjoyable. So you take care, and we'll be seeing you all soon.
Thank you,
Okay,
Jamie.
thank you so much.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.